Hey everybody, I'm Joe, and around here we like to talk about monsters. So I want to talk about a classic monster today. Not just classic in D&D, but classic in culture. Classic in the sense of it having just eternal interest in movies and television and in games. We're talking about the vampire today. We're talking about how to run it at the table, how to build story around it, how to run it in combat, and I think just as importantly, what challenge rating it should actually be. Let's jump into it. So the vampire is so iconic and something that we all want to use in our games. And I think there's a lot to say about running it in combat. So while I normally like talking about lore first and combat second, I'm going to do it the other way around today. You can find the vampire on page 297 of your monster manual, and you'll also find a variation for a warrior vampire with a higher AC, a spellcasting vampire with up to 5th level spells, and you'll also find the challenge rating 5 vampire spawn, which we will use in conjunction with the vampire when we build an encounter. So taking a look at the vampire in combat, outside of the abilities and the weaknesses that we're going to use for lore purposes, it's actually very simple in combat. It is able to make a multi-attack with 2 attacks. Only one of those can be a bite inside of its own attack action in combat. It has the ability to also do an unarmed strike. So the unarmed strike has a +8 to its to hit roll, which is pretty chunky, and it does a 1d8 +4 for damage, which is an average of 8 or 9, depending on if you round up or down. So we're going to use the average from the book, saying that the unarmed strike does an average of 8 damage. Now, it can replace a multi-attack with a grapple. So if it hits, it does not do the damage, it instead grapples with a DC 18 to escape. A grappled, unconscious, or restrained target can be the target of a bite attack. Now the bite attack does 2 types of damage, an average of 7 piercing damage and an average of 10 necrotic damage. So an average amount of damage of 17. The hit point maximum of the target is then reduced by the bite attack equal to the necrotic damage. So there are 2 aspects to this. The first is it's an average of 17 damage, and the other aspect is that it lowers the hit point maximum, meaning that the target cannot be healed above a certain maximum until a long rest, by an average of 10 per successful attack. This means that we have 8 damage from an unarmed strike and 17 from a bite attack during the vampire's turn. That's an average of 25. Now, the vampire is a legendary creature. It does have the ability to spend 3 points for legendary actions, or what's described in the monster manual as 3 legendary actions, some of which cost more than 1 action, which is why I say point. It can do this at the end of other creatures' turn. There are 3 options. There is a movement option, which as a DM I really like to use. Maneuverability and mobility in a monster makes the battlefield more interesting. So while I will likely use movement as a legendary action for creatures, I will not be counting that as we look at math for the vampire right now. It can spend 1 legendary action for an unarmed strike, which could also, of course, be a grapple. And then it can spend 2 legendary actions, or 2 legendary action points, for a bite attack, meaning that it can do no more than an additional bite attack and unarmed strike. Now let's say that every single one of these is used for damage. That is a 17 for a bite attack during the creature's turn, an 8 for an unarmed strike attack, and then both of these again during other creatures' turns during legendary actions, giving us a total of 50 hit points worth of damage. That's it. That's math as written, the average of the most output that the vampire can do. That's really not that great. This is supposed to be a challenge rating 13 monster. It is an armor class of 16, not that high. It has a hit point average of 144, which, as we're going to look at, is relatively low. Normal speed, though it does get legendary action to move. It's got a pretty good bonus to its initiative. It's got a few damage resistances, but that's it. It's doing 50 points of damage per turn, 20 of which reduces the hit point maximum of the creature. And that's assuming that we didn't have to use an attack to grapple, which would have reduced the amount of damage output. This does not add up. Now, that does not mean that the vampire isn't a good monster. I would argue it's a very good monster, but it is not a challenge rating 13 monster. Let's take a look at why. Right now we're taking a look at the Dungeon Master's Guide and the section on monster statistics. This table is the most important thing that you have access to when building an appropriate monster for your table. And if I come down here to challenge rating 13 monsters, we expect a +8 to hit bonus, which is what the vampire has. We expect its damage output per round to be 81 to 86 damage and an AC of 18. And that's just not what we have. We also expect it to have 251 to 265 hit points, which is 100 hit points more than we actually are working with. So this is strange that the vampire does not have any of the stats we expect from a challenge rating 13 monster. Where would it actually fall? Well, let's do some analysis on this. When we have a mismatch of abilities, the Dungeon Master's Guide tells us that what we want to do is just take the challenge rating and move it one slot. So it does 50 hit points worth of damage on average, which would actually put it at challenge rating 7. Now, I would argue this is not a challenge rating 7 monster. First of all, the armor class of challenge rating 7 would be here, average of 15. Well, let's go ahead and say, okay, we'll move that to here, so maybe it's a challenge rating 8 monster. Well, this does not necessarily assume that the monster has legendary actions. Let's go ahead and say that that makes it a little bit more difficult again, and we're going to move it perhaps to here, challenge rating 9. And maybe that's where I would put this, that the vampire is a challenge rating 9 monster on its own. Now, we also have the ability to have the environment have monsters around it. It tells us very specifically in the monster manual that the vampire is able to summon 3d6 wolves if it's outside, or 2d4 swarms of bats or swarms of rats. Now, these are very low challenge rating monsters, and if the vampire summons 2d4 swarms of rats, it takes a 1d4 number of rounds for them even to arrive. And don't forget that the wolf, as presented, is a quarter challenge rating monster. So this might push the difficulty of the vampire a little bit farther, maybe to challenge rating 10, but I just can't see us pushing the challenge rating anticipated much farther beyond 9 or 10, meaning I would have no trouble taking the vampire and presenting it as a monster in combat against a group of 4 players that are playing at levels 9 or 10. Now, it is totally fair if you've looked at the stat block to say, wait a minute, the vampire has some very interesting mechanics on top of its standard attacks and its ability to summon creatures. What about the mobility of its spider climb? And I would say that's a very reasonable point. The vampire has the ability to spider climb difficult surfaces. It can hang upside down on ceilings. It can climb walls. This is flavorful and interesting and very cool. But once we get into challenge rating 9 and 10 monsters, I expect a certain amount of mobility anyway. I would not say that the spider climb mechanic pushes the vampire from challenge rating 10 to challenge rating 13. Now, the next thing that is important is that it has a regeneration property. The vampire is going to heal 20 hit points at the beginning of every single round. But there are restrictions to this. It cannot be in sunlight, it cannot be in running water, and it also cannot have taken damage from a certain damage type during the previous round of combat. And here's where lore trumps mechanics. If you had never looked at the stat block of the vampire, and I just said, what type of damage do you think you should be using against a vampire in Dungeons & Dragons? I bet that most new players, or players who had never looked at the stat block of the monster, would guess radiant damage. And you would be right. If the vampire has taken radiant damage, regeneration does not trigger. Not only that, but if the vampire starts its turn in some form of sunlight, then it takes an additional 20 points of radiant damage. Now, because this is an easy mechanic to guess, players can prepare for it. And just dropping a vampire against your party is not doing the vampire justice. We want to build story around them, and we're going to get to that. But what's really crucial here is if they know they're going to come up against a vampire, they are going to prepare things that deal radiant damage. How often will the regeneration ability trigger? Probably not that often. And even if it does, it effectively adds, let's say, 1 or 2 rounds worth of healing to the vampire, which is going to effectively increase its hit points from 144 to maybe 164 or maybe 184. And in that instance, we're only bringing its hit points up to where we expect them to be anyway for a higher challenge rating monster. As a result, what challenge rating should the vampire be? It's somewhere between 9 and 11, depending on how many other creatures, specifically vampire spawn, you intend to put into the environment with your players, or how many other encounters or obstacles they had to travel through to get to the vampire. With all of that in mind, let's take a look at the vampire and building a story around it, because that's where the vampire gets really good. Let's start with the lair, because why wouldn't we? When we think of a lair for a vampire, we have a very specific image in mind: a rotting tower, an old mansion. We get these ideas of these gothic horror ideas. And of course, Castle Ravenloft is a wonderful exercise in official D&D published material to create these gothic horror layers. And the regional effects of the layer are flavorful and so interesting. There are increased bats, rats, and wolves inside of the region. The thorns and the vines in the area are thick and make it difficult to traverse towards the layer. Shadows are stretched and elongated and seem to be alive inside of the layer. And of course, there is a dense blanket of fog. These layer actions are wonderful descriptions for the DM to use. They make approaching and fighting the vampire the gothic horror it should be. But you'll notice none of them actually have a mechanical detriment to your players fighting, as opposed to the layer actions that a beholder gets or that a dragon gets. The vampire, as presented, does not have the actual layer actions. Now, it does have, built into its mechanic, a charm person ability, which is completely flavorful and completely correct for the vampire to use. And it specifically says inside of the charm ability that this is not mind control, that this is simply the creature viewing the vampire as a friend and ally. That does not specifically indicate that that this charmed creature will attack the party. If you go with the spellcasting variant, then it does get a once per day dominate monster, which 100% would allow for having a charmed creature attack the party. But the vampire stat block as written does not have this ability. As a result, I would not use the charm ability of the vampire against a player. I'd use it against an NPC, an important NPC, one that they like, one that they really don't want to be killed in a gothic horror scenario. And that's exactly the risk that would be running in the scenario. So charm is an ability that the vampire has that allows you to play with the story element. If you use the vampire spellcasting variant, 100% use Dominate Monster against a creature inside of the party, one of the players, and add to the action economy of the vampire. That will make it more difficult. Now, the spellcasting variant is supposed to be challenge rating 15. We'll talk about it here in a minute in a little bit more detail, but please note that that does shift some of our analysis on the challenge rating of the monster, which is why we want to take care of it as a separate thing. What else does the vampire get? Well, it gets the ability to change forms. It can be a bat, it can be a wolf, and this is completely flavorful, it's completely accurate to the lore, but none of these things are actually useful in combat. Instead, when we build the mechanics of the combat, we assume the vampire is in vampire form. But when we are producing lore, when we're telling stories, when the players are finding people who have been attacked and bitten by vampires, there should be bats flying away. There should be howls of wolves in the background. We want to see, potentially, the vampire in animal form escaping or moving away from the party. We want fog to come out of nowhere as the characters are investigating and getting closer and closer to the gothic horror. So all of these shape change abilities are wonderful and should be used. Now, a last ability is Misty Escape that the vampire has. Misty Escape specifically says that when the vampire is reduced to 0 hit points, it is not incapacitated, it turns into mist and travels back to its coffin. This is a really important feature. Your players will absolutely know what is going on. They will know to try to follow the fog. If they're able to put the fog into direct sunlight through a spell or something like that, or an open window, then the vampire's in a lot of trouble. But they know that this is going to bring the vampire back to his casket, which is great. And it also means that now the players have to explore more of the lair. They're going to have to move into the basement. They're going to have to go to other rooms and experience other traps that the vampire would have placed there to protect himself. That is what we use the Misty Escape feature for, is forcing the party to explore more of our creepy dungeon, because they need to find the casket that the vampire is supposed to be in. If you've come upon the vampire in the room where the casket is, of course, this is going to be a very short journey, but we have the ability to explore more of a lair, and I think that that's a really important thing. So let's take a look at the spellcasting variant of the vampire. And here we have what is supposed to be a challenge rating 15 monster. It is probably not challenge rating 15, but I would make the argument that if we are giving a challenge rating of 10 to the vampire, this should at least be a 12, let's say. And it's because of a couple really interesting capacities that this vampire has. First, the vampire spellcaster at the beginning of a day is going to cast non-detection. He has 3 spell slots of 3rd level. One of them will be used for non-detection. This is non-concentration, it lasts for 8 hours, and it is a protection mechanism for the vampire. He is then going to, if he sees the players coming, cast Animate Dead. No self-respecting vampire is going to have a lair that does not have a certain amount of dead buried throughout the interior or exterior of the property. As a self-protection, in order to whittle down the players as they approach, he will cast Animate Dead while staying farther away from the action. And now, and the players really want this, they're going to have to wade through undead in order to get to the vampire. That's the gothic horror trope. We definitely are going to utilize it. When they actually get to the vampire, he's going to have one of 2 big guns to pull out. Now, one of them is greater invisibility, and the other is dominate person. It's important to note that dominate person is once per day, greater invisibility is 3 times per day. So these are both concentration. They cannot both be up simultaneously. How will the vampire start? Well, I would argue the vampire would start combat with dominate person. Take out the big gun first, find a really dangerous member of the party, and try to use that member to kill the others while the vampire retreats. If the players are able to deal with this issue and move on and find the vampire, now he's going to use greater invisibility in order to allow his attacks to have advantage, attacks against him to have disadvantage, and make it easier to grapple and then bite the players that he wants. 8 damage, and here's where we get into something that's going to be the same for the spellcasting variant as it is for the regular vampire variant. When the vampire is running in combat, the regular melee attack that does an average of 8 damage is next to worthless. That's just a paltry amount of damage for the vampire to deal out. So we have to do one of 2 things. First, give the vampire a sword of some kind and just assume he has proficiency with it. Or we are going to use the multi-attack unarmed strike as a grapple in order to guarantee the bite attack. If the first melee attack misses, he does it again in an attempt to grapple. And then at the end of the next player character's turn, he's going to use his bite attack on the grappled target. Once this has been done, he uses his other legendary action to move away from the other players. Now he has to move at half speed because he's grappled somebody, but it tries to keep momentum in the game. This is the same technique that the spellcasting variant would have, it's just invisible. The main problem, of course, with the spellcasting variant is that the vampire doesn't make the grappled subject invisible. So there's a slight variation. If you have an invisible spellcasting vampire, he's going to grapple and then do a bite attack. The next player character goes, and at the end of his turn uses 2 legendary actions to do another bite attack. Then he's going to, at the end of the next player's turn, let go of the grappled target and move away, which uses his invisibility effectively. It means he has to re-grapple, but it means that he's going to have the ability to be invisible in somewhere in the room where the players can't find him until his next turn, at which point he's going to do the whole process over again. Unarmed strike, grapple, bite attack. Legendary action to bite attack. And the bite attack is the primary thing he wants to do. It is going to assist him, it is going to deplete the healing ability of his foes, and it's just going to be scarier. He does have Blight, but Blight or Bestow Curse are things that are not going to be as effective for basically increasing the terror of the situation as much as draining the life out of the players. This is a psychological warfare tactic. Now, the other spells that the spellcasting variant has are for things that are not in combat. He's got Fog Cloud, he's got Sleep, he's got Detect Thoughts, he's got Comprehend Languages. This is how the vampire operates outside of combat. He is going to understand what the people around him are saying at parties. He's going to detect thoughts on the players that he's near if they haven't figured out that he's the vampire yet. He's going to use Sleep in order to be able to attack an unwitting NPC. He's going to do Fog Cloud to be able to get away. And he is going to try to terrorize the people around him with Prestidigitation or shut doors with Mage Hand. And all of these things are flavorful, but his main combat tactics are going to be to drain life and try to do so invisibly, and that comes after basically dominating the barbarian or the fighter and trying to kill the rest of the party with them. So that's how the vampire is going to act in combat and how it operates outside of combat. When it comes to building lore about the vampire, what is there to say? The stories around vampires that we've had for well over 100 years really give you so many great ideas on what to do here. You want the vampire to be part of society. You want it to be something that the people find and communicate with and talk with. He knows people, he's well regarded, he comes to events, and at these events he scopes out his victims and places himself into a position where he is protected by society or by norms or mores. And of course, he's going to set up his own home, his own lair, with undead, with wolves, with vampire spawn, with everything else in Gothic horror that we love. He is going to try to manipulate the party. He's going to try to perhaps give them a quest. He's going to give them ideas of what to do. He's going to try to tell them that somebody else is the villain. If you have the attacks of the vampire be a murder mystery of sorts, he's going to do everything he can to push suspicion onto other characters, and do so for his own ends, if ideally possible. The vampire is going to do everything possible to manipulate the players, and then terrorize them so that they don't attack him. And then he's going to psychologically engage in warfare tactics when they are attacking his home before they ever get to him. The vampire is a case of layers of shields around the center character. He's not actually as hard to kill as his challenge rating suggests. It's the story and how you get to him that's really difficult. All right, so this has been a look at the vampire in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Have fun running the vampire at your table. If you've had fun running them, I'd love to hear stories about it below, and I'll see you next time.